Hello. Again from the Spark Storybook Bible, I'm going to read Jesus Feeds 5,000, and you'll find that on page 344. It was a beautiful sunny day as Jesus and his disciples crossed the Sea of Galilee in a boat with white sails. Jesus had been healing sick people, and many more people of all ages came to see him again that day. Maybe they could hear more of Jesus' stories or see him show God's power through another miracle. When Jesus saw the large crowd of men, women, and children, he asked his friend Philip, "How are we going to get enough food to feed all these people?" Philip answered, "I could work for 6 months and not earn enough money to buy food for all these men, women, and children." The disciples didn't know what to do. Just then, Andrew pointed to a young child and said, "Here is a boy who has 5 small loaves of bread and 2 fish. It's something, but it certainly isn't enough food for all these people." The boy looked very nervous as he said in a small voice, "Jesus, please take my food if you think it will help." Jesus took the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish that the boy offered and asked his friends to have the crowd sit down. About 5,000 people sat in the grassy meadow by the lake that day. After Jesus gave thanks to God, he blessed the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Then he shared the food with all the people who were there that day. All 5,000 people ate until they were full. Then Jesus said, "Now let's gather up all the leftovers." And do you know what? There were enough leftover pieces of bread to fill 12 large baskets, more loaves and fishes left over than the boy had given to Jesus. The disciples shook their heads in disbelief as they struggled to pick up the baskets heavy with food. The people saw the full baskets of leftovers and began to understand that something extraordinary had just happened, another miracle. Jesus smiled as he heard people say, "God must have sent Jesus to us." It was a day the boy, the disciples, and all the people would never forget. The story I have for you tonight is called Extra Yarn by Mac Barnett and illustrated by John Klassen. On a cold afternoon in a cold little town, where everywhere you looked was either the white of snow or the black of soot from chimneys, Annabelle found a box filled with yarn of every color. So she went home and knit herself a sweater. And when Annabelle was done, she had some extra yarn. So she knit a sweater for Mars too. But there was still extra yarn. When Annabelle and Mars went for a walk, Nate pointed and laughed and said, "You two look ridiculous." "You're just jealous," said Annabelle. "No, I'm not," said Nate. But it turned out he was. And even after she'd made a sweater for Nate and his dog, and for herself and for Mars, she still had extra yarn. At school, Annabelle's classmates could not stop talking about her sweater. "Quiet," shouted Mr. Norman. "Quiet, everyone. Annabelle, that sweater of yours is a terrible distraction. I cannot teach with everyone turning around to look at you." Then I'll knit one for everyone, Annabel said, so they won't have to turn around. Impossible, said Mr. Norman. You can't. But it turned out she could, and she did, even for Mr. Norman. And when she was done, Annabel still had extra yarn. So she knit sweaters for her mom and dad and Mr. Pendleton and Mrs. Pendleton and Dr. Palmer and for little Louis. She made sweaters for everyone except Mr. Crabtree, who never wore sweaters or even long pants, and who would stand in his shorts with the snow up to his knees. No sweater for me, thanks, said Mr. Crabtree. So she made Mr. Crabtree a hat. And even then, Annabel still had extra yarn. She made sweaters for all the dogs and all the cats and all the other animals too. Soon Annabel will run out of yarn, but it turned out she didn't. So Annabel made sweaters for things that didn't even wear sweaters. Things began to change in that little town. News spread of this remarkable girl who never ran out of yarn, and people came to visit from all around the world to see all the sweaters and to shake Annabel's hand. One day, an archduke who was very fond of clothes sailed across the sea and demanded to see Annabel. Little girl, said the archduke, I would like to buy that miraculous box of yarn, and I'm willing to offer you $1 million. No, thank you, said Annabel, who was knitting a sweater for a pickup truck. The archduke's mustache twitched. $2 million, he said. Annabel shook her head. No thanks. $10 million, shouted the archduke. Take it or leave it. Leave it, said Annabel. I won't sell the yarn. And she didn't. So that night, the archduke hired 3 robbers to break into Annabel's house, and they stole the box and took it to the archduke, who set off across the snow and sailed over the sea. Back to his castle. The archduke put on his favorite song and sat in his best chair. Then he took out the box and he lifted its lid and he looked inside. It was empty. His mustache quivered, it shivered, it trembled. The archduke hurled the box out the window and shouted, Little girl, I curse you with my family's curse. You will never be happy again. Oh, yes, you will, I bet. But there's the box in the ocean. And the box came back to Annabelle. It turns out she was. One last picture. Just like Jesus used a little boy's lunch, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, to feed 5,000 people. An extraordinary miracle. Something extraordinary, I think that they called it. So did Annabelle. That was a miraculous box of yarn. And with God, all things are possible. And when we share what we have, it seems to go. We seem to be able to share what we have with many, many others, more than we ever thought we could. And so I want you to continue to share your things and care for other people in this world that God gave us. Sleep in peace. God is awake. Good night.